Battlefield Hardline stands today as a reminder of what happens when a franchise loses sight of its own identity. Released in 2015, it arrived on the heels of Battlefield 3 and Battlefield 4, games that had cemented the series as the premier experience for large-scale combined arms warfare. At its best, Battlefield was defined by spectacle, collapsing skyscrapers and crumbling buildings, jets and helicopters dominating the skies, and the chaos of infantry and armour colliding across various different maps. That sense of scale is the very essence of Battlefield, is the identity of the franchise. Hardline discarded this foundation in pursuit of something entirely different. It reframed the series through the lens of cops and robbers, replacing tanks and jets with cars, motorbikes and grappling hooks. Players were accustomed to fighting across land, air and sea. Hardline replaced that with car chases and shootouts in banks and suburban areas. The shift was so dramatic that many questioned why the Battlefield name had been attached at all, and maybe it would have been better if the name was never attached. The decision was not born of ignorance but of strategy. EA sought to extend Battlefield beyond the narrow confines of military shooters, envisioning Hardline as the first step toward a broader franchise that could encompass varied settings and themes. Yet in attempting to diversify, they fractured the identity of the series itself. What emerged was a game too divorced from its lineage to satisfy longtime fans, and too awkwardly designed to stand on its own merit. It was not hated because it was broken or incompetent, it was hated and forgotten because it failed to justify its place in the Battlefield legacy. The failure of Battlefield Hardline begins with a fundamental question of identity. What does it mean to be a Battlefield game? For over a decade, the answer had been consistent and simple. Battlefield meant scale, maps that dwarfed the competition, defined classes, everyone doing their job based on the class they were playing as. It meant chaos, unfiltered gameplay where no single game was ever the same. It meant chucking on C4 on your Jeep and driving into a tank like a fucking maniac. It meant tanks rolling in and levelling entire buildings and scaring the shit out of little Timmy hiding in the corner. It meant jets and helicopters fighting in the skies. It meant teamwork because the mechanics of the franchise lend itself exceptionally well to it. Now the question of teamwork in Battlefield is strange because although the game encourages players to take part in teamwork, players don't always want to take part. But nonetheless, even having 4 medics run past you without getting a revive that was Battlefield, and it was this very spectacle players came to expect. Battlefield wasn't just a shooter, it was an experience built on scope, destruction, and the fantasy of war brought to life. Hardline broke that expectation with remarkable decisiveness. The military hardware was gone, replaced with police cars and helicopters. The big sprawling maps were mostly gone too, replaced with smaller maps that suited the setting of the game a lot better, but again, didn't lend themselves to the Battlefield experience players grew accustomed to. Players were given the illusion of cops and robbers dressed up in the trappings of Battlefield's engine. Thematically, it was such a drastic pivot from the previous games that players weren't really sure how to feel about it. The game felt like a completely different game, a game that simply had the Battlefield name brandished on it to increase its exposure. It was clear that EA and DICE wanted to evolve the franchise in a new direction, and this wasn't exactly something entirely new. They already evolved the franchise with the Bad Company series where they opted for a more comedic approach, but the reason why both of the Bad Company 2 games succeeded and why Bad Company 2 went on to become a fan favourite was because they evolved the franchise in meaningful ways, implementing a lot of features that would go on to shape Battlefield games for the next decade. But most importantly, they did it while still retaining the Battlefield DNA, something that Hardline simply didn't. And as a result, Hardline entered the public consciousness already burdened with doubt. It was not simply that fans were skeptical of change. Battlefield had successfully evolved in the past, but those evolutions, whether destruction in Bad Company or the spectacle of evolution in Battlefield 4, had always been built upon the series' foundation. Hardline did not build, it replaced, and in doing so it alienated the very community that had elevated Battlefield to prominence. The game's most damning flaw, therefore, was not technical and mechanical, but conceptual. It did not know what it was supposed to be, and neither did its audience. If Hardline sought to distinguish itself from previous Battlefield entries, nowhere was this more evident than in its single-player campaign. The developers abandoned the familiar military theme and instead presented the story as a crime drama series. Instead of missions, there were episodes which leaned into the whole crime drama theme. There were even recaps, and in a way they were needed because God was this story forgettable.
Previously on Hardline. Police!
I mean, it was a conscious attempt at trying something else from the overdone military stories from previous games that, although offered a different cast, were always based on the same themes and concepts. This was not another war story, but rather a TV crime drama translated into game form. Yet, once the stylistic flourishes faded, what remained was a shallow, disjointed experience that underscored the game's wider identity crisis. The narrative followed Detective Nick Mendoza, a rookie cop betrayed by his colleagues and drawn into a cycle of corruption, revenge, and personal disillusionment. The premise of the story actually had some potential. It could have explored the systemic corruption within America and offer a critique of justice compromised by greed and betrayal. Instead, the story unfolded in the most conventional way possible. You could have predicted everything that was going to happen along the way. You had your typical honest cop, the one trying to save everyone and the one that upholds the law, the corrupt superior who was pulling the strings, and the treacherous ally. Plot twists were telegraphed long before they arrived, leaving little room for tension or surprise, and any attempt at those felt lazy because, like I said, you already knew what was coming anyway. What might have been an opportunity to ground Battlefield in a morally complex, contemporary story collapsed into a predictable police drama that aspired to the depth of television but delivered only imitation. Mechanically, the campaign revealed even deeper contradictions. To reinforce its law enforcement theme, Hardline introduced non-lethal gameplay systems, tasers and stealth mechanics designed to encourage you not to use force. It made sense for sure and was immersive in a way. You could show your badge and arrest people, but it also meant the encounters became boring and repetitive. The game even encourages stealth in some areas. The problem is that the game doesn't offer any great mechanics that reinforce the idea of stealth. Sure, you have the ability to throw a coin to distract an enemy, but that's about it. There is no cover system or any places for you to hide. It led to many sections of the campaign being frustrating to play and just downright boring. The story also doesn't do a great job of making you actually care about any of the characters. You learn about the protagonist throughout the story, but I personally never truly cared about him. In the end, the single player did not redefine Battlefield's campaigns. It reinforced their reputation as hollow diversions. It deserves credit for trying something different, but it's also fair to say that it didn't succeed. The campaign wasn't all terrible. It actually fit the game itself because it was forgettable. We all know that Battlefield campaigns have never been something to write home about. The best story in the franchise still remains, in my opinion, Bad Company 2. But at least both Battlefield 3 and 4 had memorable missions that made the campaign feel somewhat worthwhile. With Battlefield Hardline, the campaign simply felt like a waste of time. It offered no great missions or set pieces, and the best way to summarise it is with one word: forgettable. The central tragedy of Battlefield Hardline lies in its multiplayer. For the Battlefield franchise, multiplayer had never been an optional component or an afterthought. It was the very foundation of the series. Campaigns could fail, technical issues could plague a launch, but as long as multiplayer retained its scale, its chaos and its distinctiveness, Battlefield endured. This truth made Hardline's shortcomings all the more glaring. By pivoting toward a smaller, faster and more conventional multiplayer design, the game discarded the very qualities that had defined its lineage. On first glance, the game looks and feels a lot like Battlefield 4, and that was actually one of the criticisms the game received amongst many others. Now, that in itself wasn't that much of a problem. I think what the problem was that Battlefield 4 was still thriving when this game released. It had ironed out majority of the bugs, the game was getting updates along with the free operation maps from the community test server, and in general, everyone was still playing and enjoying Battlefield 4. So when Battlefield Hardline came out, it felt more like a reskin of Battlefield 4 rather than a whole new game. Many felt like it could have been another DLC rather than a full price standalone game. So not only did it look like Battlefield 4, which already was something that annoyed players, but it went for a theme Battlefield fans simply weren't interested in and didn't care about. One of the first issues with the multiplayer was its scale. Battlefield's reputation was built on vast, massive environments designed to accommodate infantry, tanks, jets, helicopters and attack boats. You had maps that were infantry only, but you also had maps that put all of those things into one map, and for many people, that is what Battlefield is all about. Hardline broke that structure. Its maps were compact, urban and stripped of the verticality and size that had previously created variety and unpredictability. Maps and even game modes were more focused on close quarter encounters. Personally, I have no problems with that because I've always preferred the more infantry focused side of Battlefield games. That isn't to say that I don't love the all-out warfare chaos, because I do, but I think a balance of both is necessary in a Battlefield game, and that balance was lacking in Hardline. The game launched with 9 maps, with the majority of them being on the smaller side, maps like Bank, The Block and Hollywood Heights being mainly close quarter combat. and the somewhat bigger maps like Dust Bowl and Eversglade offering a little bit of space. The problem was that on the bigger maps the game suffered even more. There were no tanks or jets to fill that space, making these maps feel a lot more emptier than they actually were. The design of the maps themselves weren't all that great either in my opinion. Whereas Battlefield games always have a series of classic maps, Battlefield 1942 had Wake Island, Battlefield 2 had Strike at Karkand, Bad Company 2 had Arica Harbour, Battlefield 3 had several, like Caspian Border, Grand Bazaar and Operation Metro just to name a few, Battlefield 4 had Operation Lock at Siege of Shanghai, and Battlefield Hardline, well, it didn't have anything. Downtown is probably the only map that I would consider to have that sort of appeal. The rest of the maps are quite forgettable, but I'll give credit where credit is due, because along with all the DLCs, it went on to have 27 maps, which is a lot, but personally I prefer quality over quantity. Game modes also reflected the shift in identity. Battlefield games have always been big open battles, or these tug of war matches where every death, every revive counted. However, that feeling was mostly gone with Battlefield Hardline. The only real Battlefield game mode was Conquest. Other than that, the other game modes were created to fit the setting of cops versus robbers. Hot Wire required the criminals to capture vehicles and earn points through driving them and keeping them alive, whereas the coppers either had to destroy them or keep hold of them for themselves. It turned maps into constant car chases where the cops were chasing the criminals and vice versa. It actually made for some really cool gameplay moments where you were hanging out the passenger trying to take the car down in front of you, but it also meant that people would just drive around in circles racking up points. Overall, I think it was a cool game mode that most definitely fit the theme, but it wasn't what long-term Battlefield fans were after. Heist was also a game mode which required the criminals to blow up a save and deliver 2 packages back to a designated spot. This played somewhat similar to Russian ways. Then there was Blood Money, which played somewhat like Capture the Flag. Each team had to take money and bring it back to their vault. You also had Rescue, where you had to rescue 2 hostages. You also had your classic team deathmatch, and some more modes were added with future DLCs. As a whole, the game modes themselves weren't necessarily bad. I actually applaud Visceral for making such innovative game modes and trying something else. They fit the setting of the game, however they just weren't Battlefield. But then again, classic Battlefield game modes wouldn't work in Hardline, mainly because the maps weren't designed for them and it wouldn't translate into great gameplay. Conquest itself didn't really feel like a classic game of conquest in a Battlefield game, mainly because it lacked the all-out warfare aspect. With no tanks, jets and other vehicles, the game mode felt like a skeleton, missing aspects of the franchise that made it so beloved. Now let's talk about the actual gameplay. Although thematically the game was different, it still retained a lot of the Battlefield mechanics. Classes were still present and they all functioned and largely played the same as they always have done. The only thing that changed was that they were called differently. Assault was replaced with Operator, Engineer with Mechanic, Support with Enforcer and Recon with Professional. And although these classes were in the game, personally I felt like they lacked the synergy that classes had in other games. Now that could be down to vehicles not being as prominent, or because the game modes didn't really encourage as much synergy as some of the classics ones did. So although the game had classes, they never really felt that important to me. Now gunplay was still largely the same as Battlefield 4 and at times could feel worse. Microbursting was still viable and it felt pretty much the same. The movement was also pretty much the same. Gun customization was pretty much identical too. I will say the gun bench that was added with the Betrayal DLC, which was the last DLC, is actually really good. But it came with the last DLC and by that time, not many people were left playing the game. But the gun bench does remain the best customization the Battlefield has ever seen, so I will say that. But apart from that, the only real difference was in how you unlocked and progressed through weapons. Whereas in other Battlefield games you simply unlocked weapons through leveling up. In Hardline you earned money through playing the game. Playing the objective, getting kills, it all counted towards the money you earn. You would then spend that money on gadgets, weapons and attachments. Although this did fit the setting, it wasn't really an intuitive way to progress through the game in my opinion. Sure, it offered more freedom and choice, but personally I still preferred the classic, more linear way of unlocking equipment. Now, just like Battlefield 4, it did offer a lot of customization options, ranging from different sights, barrels, grips and camos. There was a good variety of gadgets too, with new ones like the grappling hook and ziplines being introduced. What I think Hardline did nail down was the way the vehicles played, mostly how well they felt to control, especially the cars. In previous games, Jeeps and motorbikes felt like they were skating on ice a lot of the time, and it felt like you were never really in control of them. In Hardline they felt more grounded, with more weight to them, offering greater control. And I mean it makes sense because a lot of the game modes, especially Hot Wire, focused vastly on driving and encouraged it. So it was only right to make driving and steering really good. One major thing that wasn't so good was the weapon balance. The operator class had the best weapons. The M16A3 and M416 were quite easily the best two weapons in the game, making using any other weapon pretty much pointless and making them obsolete. Balancing as a whole was a mess, but then again it wouldn't be much of a Battlefield game if the balancing was, well, somewhat balanced. So I guess that's another thing that had in common with the previous games. Hardline did receive 5 DLC expansions, with each one providing new maps and weapons, and some game modes to try to keep the small community that still played it alive. But unfortunately, even the expansions couldn't keep players on board. Many forgot about the game, and the game was pretty much dead within a year, with most people returning to Battlefield 4. Battlefield Hardline is often seen as underrated by a lot of people. Now, I'm not sure if it is underrated. I would say it didn't deserve the hate it received on launch, but it's also hard to argue against it when it steered away from so many things that made Battlefield, Battlefield. In many ways it did retain a lot of the same mechanics, but I think the main reason why people hated it or simply didn't care for it was because it lacked the Battlefield identity, and by many was simply seen as a cash grab. There is no doubt that without the Battlefield name, this game would have been received in a more positive manner, because it wasn't a terrible game like 2042. Hell, at launch it was actually playable, unlike Battlefield 4, and it actually introduced some pretty new cool features like being able to grab ammo and health off of players. But that wasn't enough when the game simply didn't feel like Battlefield. People say that it's underrated, yet it has failed to keep a solid community going, whereas other Battlefield games, even Battlefield 4, still have several servers up. Hardline only ever has one, and it's great to see that they are able to keep that one server up, and I'm glad people are enjoying the game. But it just goes to show that no one ever cared about Hardline and still really doesn't. It's not a game like Battlefield 2042 which will go down as the worst and most hated Battlefield ever, and it will be remembered. It might not be for the right reasons, but it will be remembered. Battlefield Hardline is a game that has become the forgotten Battlefield, the one no one talks about, no one plays, and the one no one really remembers.